welcome to a techniques video here on Patreon this week. Thank you for your patience as I was away for 5 days in Perry, Iowa with the Iowa Watercolor Society, and I'll tell you what, I had a wonderful, wonderful time, and I loved meeting so many new people, so many wonderful artists and humans, and specifically a few of my patrons here. I'm just so, Michelle and Lisa and Carol. And then some new patrons have come and joined us since the workshop, which is wonderful. So I want to welcome all of you too. And I just had a remarkable time. I loved Iowa. I just loved it there. In fact, I brought information for my husband to see, so we might take a trip back and also go to Nebraska, which is someplace that I've always wanted to go. And yeah, it was a lovely time. And I got home yesterday afternoon and I was tired. I have not been sleeping well, and even before I left. So I'm a little tired and achy, I guess. And so I actually slept until 8:30 this morning, and I haven't done that since I was in high school, I bet. So that was crazy. I was up, but I fell back to sleep at about 6:30 and slept till 8:30. It was wonderful. So I'm here and I wanted to create a video, a techniques video about edges, because one of you had talked about it. Actually, more than one of you have talked about your edges, and just some tips and techniques that we can use to create better edges in our work, okay? And I think I'll just start with talking about two kinds of edges in watercolor. And I have my Holbein paints here, so I'm just going to use those. So when we are working on dry paper and we put a watercolor down, okay, and just paint some watercolor on the paper, what we have created here is a hard edge, okay? And depending on the texture of the paper and depending on your technique, you can either get a really smooth edge, okay, or it can be a little rough, like this one here. So the next kind of edge, though, in watercolor is a soft edge. And so if I took water and just put it along here, and that edge sort of bleeds out into the water wash, right? That's more of a soft edge, okay, when it's not just this hard line, when it just sort of gradually disappears. And both are really useful. We have to have both in our work, all right? So you can see how I can get this one to be sort of soft and gradual, and this one can be really hard. So we have hard edges and soft edges. And you've probably noticed when we're doing projects, maybe I'll talk about soften the edge, right? And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about making it soft, making it sort of just vanish and sometimes even disappear into nothing. A lot of times we'll do that with shadows. But a lot of people get frustrated sometimes because, especially when you're doing something really specific like flower petals and you want this beautiful, clean, hard edge, what happens when we get these little imperfections along our edge? And there are a few things that we can do. And one of them we do right after we paint, when the edges are still wet. And we can take a clean, damp brush and run it along those edges and just clean them up. This is going to happen more often with cold pressed paper, less often with hot pressed paper, although it still even happens with hot pressed paper sometimes. So the reason why I basically cleaned my brush out, rolled it until all the water was sucked out of it and it came to a nice fine point, and then used the tip of the brush along that edge very, very slowly, just to smooth it out. And I know you've heard me say that a million times, let's smooth the edges. What would happen if instead I just took my wet brush right from the water and went to smooth the edges? It's going to add water into this wash and it's going to create blooms, okay? Because you're introducing more water into less water, and the water's going to rush and create blooms. So that's why I always say clean, damp brush, not wet brush. So you're rolling your brush on a paper towel or a cloth. You know, you're just rolling it like this until all the extra water is soaked out, you know, like sucked out of it. And then you can use that brush to clean up the edges. So those are some basic things, all right? Now let's say I'm painting flower petals. And I'm going to do like a one stroke type of petal. So soft and then bigger and then up and then here, bigger and up. And I've made a nice clean edge there. Okay. But let's say when I'm doing it, something about my brush kind of accidentally goes out of the line. All right. This happens all the time, right? Something is off. It's like you've messed up and you've got a little bit outside of the line. This is something that we don't want to fix right now. This is something that we just let it dry if it's something that we're still going to see, because chances are you might also be taking more paint and going right next to it with another petal. So I might, I'll do it on this side. So maybe I'm doing another petal on this side. I don't have enough water in my brush. Sorry about that. So maybe I'm doing another one on this side and I could have corrected it, right? But if it's something where you're not going to be painting over it, you're going to want to leave it alone and let it dry, all right? And then we're going to come back to it later and fix it. So if it's a big sort of variation like this, don't try to correct it. If I start to put this into wet paint right here like this, it's just going to make it worse. So on this one that I did, I can do, it's a little uneven, but this is so small that I can correct it with my clean damp brush that I've removed all the extra water out of. And you see how I'm just carrying the tip of that brush all along the edges to clean them up. And it just takes some practice. So what I would recommend is maybe making a page full of flower petals and just practicing that technique. Just practicing taking a clean, damp brush along the edges to sort of even them out, okay? Now here's another situation. Sometimes we're making an edge with a water glaze, okay? So let's just go back to flower petals because let's do a leaf. So let's say I drew a leaf on my paper. And I'm putting my water glaze down. And I'm making sure that I don't have any puddles. So I'll keep drying off my brush and just sweeping my brush through the water glaze to make sure that I don't have any puddles. If I have puddling and pooling, my paint's going to puddle and pool and it's not going to dry well. Okay, and I'm going to take some green. And I'm going to drop it in to my water glaze because I want to get really soft edges here. I don't want a hard edge at all. And maybe I want a little bit of a darker, more yellow green on this side. So I'm just dropping in another green and I'm letting those colors mix and mingle and just sort of spread on their own. I can clean my brush, roll it to a point, okay? And you'll notice that sometimes it goes all the way to the edge, but not always. So what I want to do is I want to take my clean damp brush, that's all the extra has been wicked out of it. I'm going to turn my paper this way. I like to work toward myself. You see how I'm going along the edge with this clean damp brush and very carefully moving it along the edge. And what happens is that damp brush is drier than that puddle of watercolor, okay? And it's pulling the paint toward the brush. So I'm just going along the edges and putting a nice clean edge, very soft edge. Now one thing this does is it removes the opportunity for hard edges to form. So I can even clean my brush, dry it off again, roll it to a point, make sure your brush is nice and dry, and run it one more time along the edge, just like we did over here with this petal. And by doing that, we are removing a big chance to have a big part of the chance that you'll get like a hard edge. Okay? Okay, and so I let these dry for a little bit. This one's still kind of wet. But this was just a way to show you what happens when we use too much water, okay? And then we went and we reintroduced stuff into this one, and this one also had too much water. These are perfectly fine, all right? This one here dried perfectly fine. It has smooth edges, and there wasn't too much water. So just take note what happens when we use too much water. We get hard edges, all right? And we get these blooms and blossoms. So we have to practice to find that balance where we're not pooling the paint on our paper, but we're giving it like just a nice glaze of color. Now I'm gonna go over this one again to show you another way that edges can be a problem. So I'm just gonna pick up some green paint. And let's say I want to paint a glaze layer on top of this so I can leave some veins, right? So I can start at the top, and I'm just going to pull this layer all the way down here. And I'm taking it all the way to my edge. And I'm going to put some on the other side. Again, I'm trying to not have too much paint, but I'm just trying to put an even glaze layer on. So I've created the center vein by putting this second layer on, okay? Sometimes what happens with our edges when we put a second layer on is we don't meet the outside edge well. And so we'll either be inside of it a little bit or outside a little bit, and then our edges start to look really messy. So once again, we can take a clean, dry brush. I'm gonna get a smaller one. I'm using a really big brush for these little guys. Let's see. I'm gonna go to a number 2. So I've got a clean, damp brush now, and I can still make my way around the edges and make sure that I don't have any really bumpy spots, that the edges are even. And this, this looks pretty good, but even in the center vein, I can sort of smooth if I need to. And we don't want to be too fiddly, because sometimes these things we're overreacting, and these things are not going to be visible at all in our finished painting. But if I wanted to, I can go in when it's still damp, and I can smooth out those edges, all right? Now, if we go into it and we leave, like over here on this one, and we leave a little space that doesn't have color, for instance, if that's the problem, we can always just put another layer on, or we can go in with a damp brush, not a wet brush, and just lightly soften and blot. We can always do that. Okay, but the practice part is trying to get your paint to the edge without going over or going in too far. All right, so it just takes practice. It takes practice, and it takes practice with using the correct amount of water. So sometimes I wish there was a magic bullet, but there isn't. It's really called time and practice and effort. Now I want to go back to this. And you can see here, when I zoom in on this, how my edges are rough, okay? I'm gonna fix that. So once it's totally dry, I can go in with a scrubber brush or a really stiff, small, pointed synthetic brush. And I can get some clean water on it. I don't want the water dripping off of it, so I usually just wipe it off. And I can go in right outside that line. Actually, I'm gonna go this way so I can reach it better. I'm gonna go in right outside that line, and I can lightly buff that line, okay? If I want to, I can just go in and lightly buff it and dab it with water. So what's happening, now we can go over this side and do it too. What's happening is I'm actually removing a little paint, okay? Now what happens if we go and we do it on the inside of the line? You see how it lifted paint up from the inside of the line? That's why we move our paper around so we're on the outside of the line. So we can go back and forth and smooth those edges a little bit, but only affect the outside. So sometimes these scrubber brushes can be a little harsh on certain papers, like they're definitely harsh on this smooth paper. So I can take a short, stiff, pointed round. This is a zero by Da Vinci Nova. And I can use this brush to just wiggle back and forth along the edges, just sort of smoothing those edges out and then dabbing them with a brush. That other brush just ruined the paper, it really did. Here at the end, I've got this little area that sort of dried hard. I can move this little brush back and forth and get rid of it. This hard line along the edge, I can move my brush back and forth and I can make it better. Okay, sometimes it's not going to totally go away and sometimes it takes more than one try, but I can definitely make it better. That really took it all away. You can see here where that other brush abraded the paper. So it takes a pretty, like this is better for like a cold press or rough press. This paper is pretty delicate. Now let's go over here. We're going to do the same thing. Remember where I said if you go off of the line completely, how you can fix it? Well, I can go in with the same kind of brush, just wiggle it back and forth, dab it, clean my brush, dry it off, do it again. Just wiggling it back and forth, dab it. See how it cleaned it right up? Cleaned it right up. Now there's a bloom in here from when I introduced that little bit to show you. You know, there's not a whole lot I can do with that. If it's really, you know, those things don't bother me. To me, they're part of watercolor. But if it bothers you, then you're going to really have to start over or put another layer on top to just sort of diminish it. Because if I go in there and I start to mess around with it, it's going to change it too much. All right. So those kinds of things happen when we introduce too much water. You know, it's a balance, right? It's either not enough water or too much water. So you can see, I can go over here now, and I want to turn my paper. I can try to clean up that hard edge. All right, it works really, really well. This one, you can see what happened. I mean, this one's kind of a mess. There's just way too much water in it. But I can clean up the edges a little bit. And this is still actually even wet, so I don't even know if I could affect it at all. Tiny little movements at the edge, putting my brush toward the edge so it's not spreading the paint out beyond, or lifting it, all right, from within. So this one turned out the best. This is where I had my smoothest water to paint ratio and my smoothest application. These turned out great as well, all right, and I fixed that little bit, okay? So again, it's practice. One other thing that I want to talk about is practicing those water to paint ratio brush strokes. So sometimes what happens is, I think, let me use this color. I'll use Permanent Alizarin Crimson. So if I go on the paper, let me just turn this around again. And I'm painting flowers, and you know, I put my petals down. You know, these are working pretty well. Okay. And these look like the edges will dry very well and all of that. It's because my brush did not let out too much water at once. And you don't see any pooling on here whatsoever, okay? But if I did the same thing, and also this is a really good brush, so it's gonna be hard to mess up. This is a sable brush, so it's gonna be hard. But let's say I used a synthetic brush like this one. And I did the same. Synthetic brushes can be a little trickier because they don't let the water and paint out. They take a little bit more practice, to be honest with you. They don't let the water and paint out in the same way. So let's say I'm doing it with a synthetic brush. And I put my brush down, I'm pushing. See how, number one, it's not letting off as much paint, right? So I'm going to be tempted to go over it. And to see how it's not picking up the paint at the end of my stroke. Stable brushes are very absorbent, right? And we've talked about that, how we want our brushes to be really, really absorbent, okay? Not just springy, but also absorbent. So if I do this again, I have tons of water on my brush and I lift it up. You just have to, see that left too much paint, okay? So with this brush, I learned that I've got to be very light with it. I can't, too much, see? I put too much water back into it. That's going to leave a bloom. So it's also your brush and your tools and learning to use them well. These, you know, this is one thing that natural fiber brushes are really, really good for. And that is controlling the paint flow. You know, controlling, I have a hard time finding where to go. You can see. There, I didn't wipe my brush off at all. I just put tons of paint on it and did it. And you can see that even a natural brush will do the same. Okay, so it will make your job easier, but you've got to have a really light touch when you disengage and when you put down your paintbrush. So just practice that. Practice it. You know? If I do come up and it does that, I can always stick my brush in when it's still wet and just sort of wick some of that up. And then what do I want to do? I want to clean my brush, roll it to a point, and I want to go around and clean up those edges if I'm looking for that really refined edge. All right. And one other thing to remember from this is if we end up having a hard line, it's okay. We can fix it. So I can go in with this and rub it back and forth. Clean, damp brush. Right? Dab it. And it takes more than one time. Almost always. There, made it better. It's never going to make it perfect, but you can make it better. So with all of this said about edges, really the main thing that I worry about is if I've gone out of bounds somewhere and it really made a difference. Like if I'm making a leaf and all of a sudden, you know, I've gone, oops, and I've gone outside of the leaf and I didn't mean to do it. And that will have an effect on your painting. If it's just a little jag or a little bloom or something like that, I just don't worry about it. But something like this isn't going to look right. And that's when I use something like a scrubber brush or a sharp, a stiff pointed round to lift with clean water after it's totally dry. We can go in while it's still wet and just dab it if we know we're going to lift it later and see what happens, and that'll make our job a lot easier. But do not try to remove it by scrubbing when it's still wet, okay? So that's it. That's really all I can think of with edges. It's just really about learning to control your water flow off your brush, all right? So you can see these turn out pretty well. But then when you add way too much water and paint, you're going to get blooms and funky edges on things. That's just the way it is. There are ways to correct it, but it's never going to be perfect. So that's why it's good to practice. And it's good to not be too much of a perfectionist too, right? It's really important to just know what matters and what doesn't. And then one last thing that we did talk about was our edges being soft or hard. And a hard edge is like this, you know, where it's just paint against paper. And a soft edge is where it gradually fades. All right, everybody, I hope this was helpful. And I will be back tomorrow with a dandelion lesson. All right, take care, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.